I signed a silence agreement before they allowed me to leave Greenland in 1956. The paper said I had witnessed environmental anomalies. That was their word, anomalies. But ice doesn't whisper, ice doesn't breathe, and it sure as hell doesn't remember footsteps that were made centuries before ours. We were supposed to be mapping radar coverage along the polar defense line, routine Cold War work. Instead, we discovered a collapsed ice shelf exposing a tunnel carved deep beneath the glacier. Our instruments failed the moment we approached it. Our radios echoed voices that weren't ours. And inside, we found markings older than any military expedition recorded in that region. 2 men walked in ahead of me. Only one came back, and he wasn't speaking English anymore. This testimony was never meant to survive. Welcome to Combat Lore Files, where the shadows of war live on. Hit subscribe and get nightly drops of stories like this. They told us the Arctic was empty, but every time our instruments failed, it felt like something down there was quietly listening. I arrived at Outpost K-17 in early February of 1956, flown in aboard a transport aircraft that barely survived the landing against screaming polar winds and visibility so poor it felt like we were descending into a blank sheet of death. My name is Lieutenant Daniel Mercer, U.S. Air Force navigator assigned to Arctic aerial reconnaissance under a classified early warning initiative designed to detect Soviet missile activity over the polar route. The Cold War had reached a point where even frozen wastelands became strategic chessboards, and our job was to map radar blind spots across Greenland's glacial interior. The base itself wasn't much more than steel-reinforced barracks half buried under compacted snow, surrounded by antenna towers that constantly groaned under the weight of ice storms. The air smelled like diesel fuel, wet canvas, and fear disguised as routine discipline. Every morning began with the same ritual: checking frostbitten aircraft panels, recalibrating navigation equipment that never seemed to hold accuracy for more than a few hours, and reviewing flight routes that traced across regions so isolated, even satellite charts of the time barely captured their detail. The Arctic didn't just test machinery, it gnawed at the human mind. Men talked less after a few weeks stationed there. Sleep came in fractured bursts haunted by wind shrieks that sounded too deliberate, almost like distant howling. Our crew consisted of 4 men. Captain Roland Hayes, our pilot and mission commander whose calm voice never cracked, even during turbulence that felt like the sky itself was trying to tear the aircraft apart. Sergeant Thomas Grady, radio operator with a talent for fixing communications equipment using scrap parts and pure stubbornness. Specialist Mark Ellison, reconnaissance photographer whose camera never left his chest harness. And me, responsible for mapping flight coordinates and monitoring radar interference patterns. Before my arrival, previous patrol logs had mentioned strange magnetic fluctuations occurring over Sector Echo 9, a glacial plateau stretching miles beyond known research expeditions. Command labeled the disturbances as solar radiation anomalies, but maintenance crews quietly passed rumors that compasses had spun violently mid-flight and altimeters dipped for seconds without cause. I dismissed those stories at first, assuming Arctic fatigue and imagination were blending together. But our first mission briefing hinted something different. Captain Hayes laid out aerial survey routes across a navigation board covered in frost crystals, explaining that radar stations along the polar defense line required updated mapping data to close potential missile approach corridors. The mission was described as routine, the word routine, repeated so often it began to feel rehearsed rather than reassuring. The morning of our recon flight arrived wrapped in dim twilight, the Arctic sun barely cresting the horizon like a fading ember behind layers of snow haze. Our aircraft engines roared to life, sending vibrations through the fuselage that rattled teeth and loosened frozen bolts along the wing panels. As we lifted off, the base shrank into a cluster of metallic dots swallowed by endless white terrain. Hours passed in mechanical rhythm, monitoring instruments, adjusting coordinates, recording ice shelf formations beneath us. The Arctic from above looked deceptively peaceful, a silent ocean frozen mid-wave. But the stillness felt unnatural, like a landscape holding its breath. Roughly 90 miles into Sector Echo 9, our compass needle began twitching erratically. At first, I recalibrated it, assuming magnetic drift caused by polar proximity. But then the radar screen flickered with bursts of static that pulsed in rhythmic intervals. Sergeant Grady tapped his headset, muttering that he was receiving background frequencies resembling overlapping signals, almost like multiple broadcasts trying to occupy the same channel simultaneously. Captain Hayes ordered altitude adjustment to improve signal clarity, and that was when Ellison shouted from the observation window. Beneath us, stretching across a glacier the size of a small city, was a jagged fracture cutting through the ice sheet in a nearly straight line. Natural glacier splits usually formed branching patterns influenced by pressure and temperature gradients, but this one carved forward with unsettling precision, like something had sliced the surface open using an enormous blade. As we circled lower, sunlight reflected along the fracture's edges, revealing depth far beyond typical ice collapses. The fissure widened in sections, exposing shadowed cavities that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. My navigation equipment completely lost calibration, the gyroscopic stabilizer trembling violently, while altitude readings fluctuated by hundreds of feet without actual descent. Grady's radio erupted into bursts of static layered with faint, distorted echoes that almost sounded like speech repeating itself seconds after he spoke. Hayes maintained control, though I noticed sweat soaking through his flight gloves despite the sub-zero cabin temperature. Ellison snapped photograph after photograph, whispering that he could see geometric shapes forming along the fracture walls, angles too symmetrical to be natural ice erosion. The deeper we studied the split, the clearer it became that the glacier had not simply cracked. Something beneath it had forced its way upward, carving an entrance sloping into darkness. A gust of wind surged across the open fissure, creating a hollow resonance that carried through our aircraft hull. A low, droning hum that vibrated through my chest like a distant engine buried under miles of ice. Hayes ordered a return loop to mark the coordinates, but as we banked away, my headset filled with a brief, chilling burst of audio. 3 distinct knocks echoing through the radio channel before the signal died completely. None of us spoke during the return flight. The Arctic below seemed less empty now, its endless frozen surface hiding shapes our instruments refused to measure. Back at base, when we reviewed Ellison's photographs, the fracture edges revealed smooth interior walls descending at an unnatural slope, resembling the entrance to a tunnel rather than a collapsed glacier shelf. Command instructed us to prepare a ground survey to investigate what they still insisted was a geological anomaly. But deep down, as I stared at those photographs, I felt an instinct older than training whispering that we hadn't discovered a natural collapse. We had uncovered an opening deliberately carved beneath the frozen world, and something about its symmetry suggested it wasn't abandoned, only waiting for someone foolish enough to step inside. What we believed was a natural ice collapse soon revealed something carved, something deliberate, waiting beneath the frozen surface. The Arctic teaches you quickly that silence is never empty. It is usually watching, measuring, waiting for you to take the next step. We deployed to the fracture zone less than 16 hours after our aerial survey, ordered to conduct a limited ground inspection despite worsening weather conditions and equipment instability reports filed from our previous flight. I remember the transport descent vividly. The glacier stretched beneath us like a shattered mirror reflecting a dying sun, the fracture now appearing wider and darker than our initial reconnaissance suggested. The moment our landing skids touched the snow crust, a violent gust slammed against the aircraft, forcing Captain Hayes to shut engines immediately before wind shear could flip us sideways. The air outside was sharp enough to burn lungs with every breath, the cold seeping through layered thermal gear as if the Arctic itself resented our arrival. We unloaded survey instruments, portable radar scanners, rope anchors, and emergency flare kits, while Specialist Ellison continued documenting everything through his camera lens, muttering quietly that the fracture edges looked different from above, smoother, almost polished. As we approached the split in the glacier, our boots crunched against snow hardened into crystalline plates that reflected pale blue light from the overcast sky. The fracture revealed itself slowly, widening into a jagged canyon of ice descending at an unnatural slope. Natural ice breaks typically form chaotic edges, but this formation appeared disturbingly controlled, its interior walls curving inward with geometric precision that resembled architectural shaping rather than environmental collapse. I dropped to one knee near the edge, securing my harness while lowering a magnetic probe into the opening, expecting erratic readings due to polar interference. Instead, the device emitted a continuous high-pitched tone before shutting down entirely, its display screen flickering with scrambled symbols before fading to black. Sergeant Grady attempted radio contact with the base, but static flooded his channel, layered with faint oscillations that rose and fell in rhythm, like distant breathing filtered through broken speakers. Captain Hayes ordered us to continue visual inspection, reminding us this mission remained strictly observational, though I noticed his hand resting closer to his sidearm than usual. As we descended cautiously, using rope anchors drilled into the ice shelf, the temperature within the fracture shifted unexpectedly. The air felt less biting, carrying a damp chill that smelled faintly metallic, like wet stone hidden beneath snowpack. About 30 feet below the surface, the fractured wall opened into a sloping corridor carved directly into the glacier, descending into a tunnel whose entrance swallowed ambient light. I ran my gloved hand across the interior surface, feeling something deeply unsettling. The ice was smooth beyond natural formation, not melted and refrozen, but shaped, as if enormous tools had shaved the surface into symmetrical curves. Ellison photographed the entrance repeatedly, his flash revealing faint ridges running along the tunnel walls, resembling etching patterns or tool scoring marks preserved beneath frozen layers. Grady adjusted his radio antenna while whispering that he was receiving intermittent signal bursts, repeating fragments of our previous transmissions, with delayed echoes layered beneath them. The sound produced a nauseating dissonance, like hearing our voices replayed through someone else's memory, rather than a mechanical recording. Hayes directed us to plant seismic monitors near the entrance to measure glacial stability. But every device we activated malfunctioned within seconds, screens freezing or emitting rapid clicking noises before dying completely. I checked my compass instinctively, watching its needle spin in slow circles before locking onto a direction that pointed directly into the tunnel, rather than toward magnetic north. The deeper darkness ahead felt wrong, not merely shadowed but dense, absorbing light in a way that created the illusion of depth far beyond visible range. As we debated whether to proceed further, Specialist Ellison froze mid-step, raising his camera toward the tunnel interior before lowering it slowly. He whispered that he heard something echoing from inside, footsteps moving across frozen ground, spaced unevenly, like someone walking with a slight limp. We all paused, holding our breath, listening as the faint sound repeated itself, each step producing a hollow resonance that traveled through the tunnel's curvature before fading into silence. Hayes called out into the darkness, his voice sharp and commanding, but the only response was the delayed return of his own words bouncing through unseen chambers beyond our view. Grady swore under his breath, adjusting his headset again as faint, whisper-like frequencies crackled through his radio channel, too distorted to decipher, yet unmistakably layered, as though multiple voices attempted to speak simultaneously through broken transmission lines. I felt sweat forming beneath my thermal hood, despite the freezing environment, a creeping instinct warning that we were standing at the threshold of something deliberately hidden beneath centuries of accumulating ice. Ellison pointed his flashlight deeper into the corridor, revealing faint discolorations along the tunnel walls, lines resembling symbols partially obscured by frost, curved shapes intersecting in repeating patterns that looked too intentional to dismiss as natural striation. Hayes radioed base again, requesting immediate geological support, but communication collapsed entirely into static pulses that rose in volume until Grady ripped his headset off in frustration. The Arctic wind above howled through the fracture opening, producing a distant harmonic wail that merged with the faint echoes inside the tunnel, creating an unsettling harmony that made it difficult to distinguish environmental sound from something else entirely. Protocol dictated immediate withdrawal under communication failure, yet none of us moved toward the rope anchors leading back to the surface. Instead, we stared into that descending passage carved beneath the glacier, each of us recognizing silently that this discovery extended beyond routine military anomaly. Hayes finally spoke, his voice lower, almost reluctant, stating that command would demand physical confirmation of any structural formation beneath strategic polar routes. He ordered us to establish a temporary survey perimeter and prepare exploratory lighting equipment for interior assessment, fully aware that our standing orders prohibited unauthorized subterranean entry. As we unpacked additional gear and secured anchor lines leading into the tunnel mouth, I felt a strange certainty settle over me. The same instinct soldiers describe before walking into combat zones where survival odds collapse into blind probability. The tunnel did not feel abandoned. It felt patient, as though our arrival had triggered something long dormant beneath the glacier's weight. Grady activated emergency flare sticks to mark our entry path, their red glow casting elongated shadows across the polished ice walls that twisted unnaturally as the corridor curved downward into darkness. Hayes checked his watch, then looked toward each of us with a silent acknowledgement that we were about to cross a line no mission briefing had prepared us for. Curiosity overpowered protocol, and against standing orders, we prepared to explore the tunnel's interior. The moment we stepped inside the tunnel, the wind from the surface stopped following us, as if something deeper preferred silence. Captain Hayes led the formation, his flashlight beam cutting through suspended ice particles drifting in the air like frozen dust. I followed close behind, monitoring a handheld navigation unit that had already begun displaying erratic coordinate readings, while Sergeant Grady secured the flare trail behind us, and Specialist Ellison documented every surface we passed with quiet, obsessive precision. The tunnel sloped downward at a steady angle, wide enough for 3 men to walk side by side, though none of us wanted that closeness. The deeper we moved, the more the temperature shifted in ways that defied Arctic logic. The air no longer carried the sharp sting of surface frost. Instead, it settled into a damp chill that clung to exposed skin and filled my lungs with a metallic aftertaste. Every breath sounded louder than it should have, echoing softly against walls too smooth to be natural. I dragged my gloved fingers across the ice again, feeling subtle grooves running parallel to our path, narrow ridges that repeated in precise intervals like markings left by massive cutting instruments. Hayes ordered periodic equipment checks, but every device continued malfunctioning in strange, inconsistent ways. My compass needle had stopped spinning and now pointed straight ahead, locked firmly toward the tunnel's descending direction, regardless of how I rotated the device. Grady attempted another radio transmission to base, speaking slowly into his headset, but his words returned through the receiver seconds later, distorted and layered beneath unfamiliar murmuring frequencies that caused him to rip the headset away in visible discomfort. Ellison's camera flash illuminated sections of the wall, revealing faint carvings partially concealed beneath layers of frost. At first, they resembled fragmented Norse runic patterns, shapes I vaguely recognized from navigation briefings discussing Viking exploration routes across polar territories centuries ago. But the symbols quickly diverged into unfamiliar designs, elongated figures with hollow facial impressions, curved lines intersecting into circular formations that resembled diagrams rather than language. The further we advanced, the tunnel ceiling began rising, forming natural arches that amplified our footsteps into hollow reverberations trailing behind us. After several minutes, I noticed something deeply unsettling. Our steps were echoing back with irregular timing, sometimes delayed longer than normal acoustic reflection, sometimes repeating twice with slight variations in rhythm, as though another set of footsteps mirrored ours from somewhere beyond visible range. I slowed my pace deliberately, pressing my boot down harder against the ice floor, listening as the echo followed a moment later with the same force. Grady froze when he heard it too, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as he whispered that he could swear someone was walking behind us, matching our stride but remaining just outside the light's reach. Hayes dismissed the possibility, blaming acoustic distortion caused by tunnel curvature, but his voice lacked conviction. We continued descending until the tunnel leveled briefly into a wider corridor, where frost patterns along the walls formed symmetrical spirals resembling deliberate design. Ellison knelt beside one of the carvings, brushing away ice crystals carefully, revealing etched grooves far deeper than surface markings. He whispered that the carving depth suggested tools strong enough to cut through glacial density, tools that would have required engineering beyond primitive exploration. As he documented the symbol, a faint sound rippled through the corridor, subtle at first, like fabric dragging slowly across frozen stone. We all turned simultaneously toward the darkness ahead, listening as the sound repeated, shifting into a slow, rhythmic tapping, resembling distant footsteps moving across hollow ground. Hayes raised his weapon instinctively, signaling silence while we listened for confirmation. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint, low-frequency hum vibrating through the tunnel walls. I felt the vibration travel through my boots into my chest cavity, producing a nauseating resonance that blurred concentration. Grady muttered that his radio receiver had begun picking up faint tonal pulses, matching the vibration frequency, though the signal carried no recognizable language or transmission pattern. As we advanced cautiously, the corridor narrowed again before opening into a fork, where two descending passages split in opposite directions. My navigation unit glitched violently, its display filling with scrambled coordinates overlapping each other like layered maps. Hayes chose the left passage, marking the fork with flare residue while instructing Grady to maintain visual trail integrity in case structural collapse forced rapid retreat. The left corridor descended sharply, forcing us to brace against the walls for balance, and that was when Ellison whispered that he could see movement along the far end of our flashlight range. I followed his beam, scanning the distant curvature where shadows appeared to shift independently from our light movement. It lasted only a second, a subtle ripple of darkness folding into the tunnel wall, but it was enough to send adrenaline spiking through my pulse. Hayes advanced faster, refusing to acknowledge what we had all silently witnessed, maintaining mission composure through rigid professionalism. The air continued growing warmer, condensation forming along our breathing masks, as if we were descending toward a hidden thermal source beneath the glacier. After nearly 15 minutes of cautious movement, the tunnel walls began displaying more frequent carvings, symbols clustering together into repeating sequences that wrapped around the corridor like storytelling panels. Some depicted human-like figures kneeling before towering shapes rising from beneath the ground, their elongated limbs reaching upward as if emerging from the earth itself. Others showed circular formations surrounding what appeared to be tunnel entrances, branching endlessly downward. Ellison photographed frantically, whispering that the carvings felt less decorative and more instructional, like warnings or ritual documentation preserved within the ice. Suddenly, Grady shouted that he heard footsteps again, louder this time, approaching from behind. We turned instantly, flashlights cutting across the tunnel corridor we had just traveled. But the passage remained empty, except for drifting frost particles swirling slowly in the air. Then, just as Hayes began lowering his weapon, the footsteps echoed again, this time ahead of us, matching our rhythm perfectly, as if something invisible had circled around using corridors we could not see. The realization struck all of us simultaneously. Whatever produced the echoes understood our movement patterns. Hayes ordered immediate forward advance toward visible light reflecting faintly ahead, hoping to locate a structural endpoint or natural cavern formation. As we rounded the final curve, the tunnel expanded abruptly, revealing the distant outline of a vast chamber shimmering faintly with refracted light. I felt a deep unease settling into my chest as the tunnel opened wider, its carved symmetry transitioning into something far older, far more deliberate than a simple passage beneath the glacier. And as we stepped closer to the chamber's threshold, I realized with growing dread that the echoes behind us had stopped entirely, as if whatever had followed us no longer needed to hide. Then the tunnel widened into a massive hollow space where the ice no longer resembled natural formation, and we began to understand that we hadn't been walking through erosion. we had been walking through architecture. I realized the moment our boots crossed the threshold that the tunnel had not been guiding us forward. It had been leading us somewhere prepared long before our arrival. The corridor widened gradually until it opened into a cavern so vast, our flashlight beams failed to reach its ceiling. The air inside carried a heavy stillness, thicker than any natural silence, pressing against my ears until even my breathing sounded intrusive. Frost crystals drifted lazily through the chamber like suspended ash, catching fragments of our light and scattering them across towering formations rising from the frozen floor. At first, I thought they were natural ice pillars shaped by centuries of freezing wind currents. But as our eyes adjusted, their arrangement revealed deliberate symmetry. The pillars stood in circular alignment, evenly spaced, forming a ring around a central structure encased in layers of translucent ice. Captain Hayes signaled us to spread into a cautious perimeter while maintaining visual contact, his posture rigid with the kind of tension I had only seen during live-fire training scenarios. Specialist Ellison moved slowly toward the nearest pillar, his camera flash illuminating intricate carvings etched across its surface. I stepped closer behind him, studying the markings with growing disbelief. The symbols matched patterns we had seen along the tunnel walls, but were far more detailed, depicting scenes carved with unsettling precision. Figures resembling early Arctic explorers stood alongside shapes that were unmistakably not human. Tall silhouettes with elongated limbs and hollowed faces bending toward the ground, as though listening to something buried beneath the earth. Ellison whispered that the carving technique appeared ancient yet impossibly preserved, as if the ice itself had protected the designs from erosion for centuries. Sergeant Grady attempted another radio transmission to base, but the moment he activated his headset, overlapping voices burst through the receiver, layered in rapid succession, none forming recognizable words. He tore the headset away again, face pale beneath his frost-lined hood, muttering that the voices sounded like multiple conversations playing backwards simultaneously. Hayes ordered him to shut down communications entirely and focus on maintaining our exit route markers. As we advanced deeper into the chamber, the central structure came into clearer view. It rose from the cavern floor like a monolith carved from darker ice, its surface embedded with etched panels spiraling upward in concentric rings. Unlike the pillars, which appeared partially organic in formation, the monolith carried the unmistakable impression of constructed architecture. Its angles were sharp, deliberate, and too precise to have formed naturally beneath shifting glacial pressure. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam revealing additional carvings along its surface, rows of humanoid figures kneeling around circular openings resembling tunnel entrances descending beneath the structure. Above them, towering shapes extended upward, their elongated forms merging into spiral patterns that repeated along the monolith's vertical face. The carvings conveyed movement, ritual, and submission in ways that stirred a primal unease deep within my instincts. Ellison circled the structure, photographing each panel while whispering observations into his recorder, noting how the carvings appeared to narrate a sequence of events rather than decorative symbolism. Hayes inspected the cavern perimeter, confirming the chamber extended into multiple shadowed corridors branching outward beyond our visible range. The silence inside the cavern grew increasingly oppressive, broken only by the faint drip of melting frost from the ceiling far above, each droplet striking the frozen floor with an echo that lingered unnaturally long. I placed my gloved hand against the monolith's surface, expecting the familiar brittle chill of glacial ice, but instead felt a faint vibration pulsing through the structure. It was subtle, rhythmic, almost like a distant heartbeat trapped beneath layers of frozen stone. I withdrew my hand immediately, my pulse accelerating as the vibration seemed to intensify momentarily before fading again. Grady shouted suddenly, drawing our attention toward the chamber entrance. He pointed at the tunnel we had used to enter, claiming he saw movement flicker along the corridor walls, shadows bending against the curvature as though something had retreated deeper into the passage. Hayes dismissed the sighting as light distortion caused by flare reflection, but I noticed his grip tightening around his weapon as he repositioned himself closer to the monolith. Ellison stepped toward the structure's base, brushing frost from a lower panel to expose deeper carvings partially concealed beneath thick ice layers. He called us over, his voice trembling slightly as he described the imagery. The panel depicted multiple groups of figures approaching the monolith across different eras, some wearing primitive Arctic clothing, others clad in what resembled early naval expedition uniforms. Each group appeared to kneel before the structure while elongated shapes emerged from circular openings beneath it. The final section of the carving depicted figures dissolving into the ice itself, their outlines fading into the structure's surface as though absorbed. Hayes ordered immediate documentation, sensing historical significance that extended far beyond our mission parameters. As Ellison adjusted his camera lens, a faint cracking sound echoed through the cavern. At first, it resembled normal glacial shifting, but the sound carried a sharper, more brittle tone, like glass fracturing under internal pressure. We froze, scanning the chamber walls, searching for structural collapse indicators. The cracking sound repeated, louder this time, originating from the monolith itself. Thin fracture lines began spreading across its surface, glowing faintly as trapped air escaped through microscopic fissures. The vibration beneath my boots intensified, resonating upward through my legs and chest, producing a low-frequency hum that blurred my hearing. Grady stumbled backward, shouting that his radio, despite being powered off, had begun emitting static pulses matching the vibration rhythm. Ellison lowered his camera slowly, eyes fixed on the monolith as the fracture lines expanded across its upper surface. Hayes shouted orders to prepare for immediate evacuation, but none of us moved as a deep, rumbling resonance filled the chamber, vibrating through the pillars surrounding us. The ice around the monolith shifted subtly, as if something inside pressed outward against its frozen shell. I stepped back instinctively, my mind racing through every survival protocol drilled into me, yet unable to process the impossible reality unfolding before us. The fracture widened further, releasing a burst of trapped frost vapor that drifted upward like breath escaping from beneath the ice. The carvings along the monolith's surface seemed to distort under shifting light reflections, their etched figures appearing almost animated as the structure vibrated with growing intensity. Hayes grabbed my shoulder, shouting for retreat. But before we could move, a sharp cracking sound split through the cavern like thunder trapped underground. The monolith's outer layer fractured visibly, and a hollow echo reverberated from deep within its core, carrying a tone that sounded disturbingly close to a voice struggling to emerge through frozen barriers. As we stared in frozen disbelief, the ice around the monolith began cracking. From the inside, the first crack inside the monolith didn't sound like breaking ice. It sounded like something exhaling after centuries of suffocation. The vibration spread through the chamber floor, rattling loose frost from the surrounding pillars while thin fracture veins crawled across the structure's surface like glowing scars. Captain Hayes shouted for immediate withdrawal, but Lieutenant Harris, our structural engineer who had remained silent through most of the descent, stepped closer to the monolith instead of retreating. His posture shifted subtly, shoulders relaxing as if he were listening to something we couldn't hear. I grabbed his arm, ordering him back toward the exit path, yet he barely reacted, his gaze locked onto the widening fractures spreading along the frozen surface. The low-frequency hum pulsing through the chamber deepened, resonating through my chest cavity in steady intervals that felt disturbingly synchronized with my heartbeat. Frost vapor seeped from the cracks, curling through the air in twisting spirals that carried a faint metallic scent, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. Harris whispered something under his breath, words too soft to distinguish, his gloved hand rising slowly toward the monolith as if responding to an unseen command. Hayes barked his name sharply, but Harris stepped forward anyway, pressing his palm against the fractured ice surface. The moment his glove made contact, the vibration intensified violently, sending a ripple across the chamber floor that knocked Ellison off balance, while Grady stumbled backward toward the nearest pillar. A deep resonance surged outward from the monolith, producing layered tones that overlapped like distorted chanting reverberating through cavern walls. Harris inhaled sharply, his posture stiffening as his head tilted slightly, listening to frequencies none of us could perceive. His voice changed when he spoke next, carrying unfamiliar cadence layered beneath his normal tone. He muttered phrases in a language none of us recognized, syllables rolling together in patterns that sounded older than spoken communication, their rhythm matching the pulsing vibration spreading through the chamber. Hayes lunged forward, attempting to pull Harris away, but a sudden tremor split the frozen floor between them, forcing him back as jagged fissures radiated outward from the monolith's base. The surrounding pillars began vibrating in resonance, frost shedding from their carved surfaces in shimmering cascades that filled the air with drifting ice particles. Ellison shouted that the carvings were shifting under the reflected light, the etched figures appearing to elongate and distort as cracks expanded across the central structure. Harris continued speaking, his voice now layered with faint, overlapping echoes repeating his words seconds after he finished each phrase. The monolith emitted a deep, hollow tone that reverberated through my skull, producing disorienting pressure behind my eyes. I staggered backward, struggling to maintain balance as the vibration increased. Grady screamed that his radio had activated again despite its power unit being disconnected. Static bursting through the speakers accompanied by faint whisper-like transmissions, repeating Harris's voice in distorted fragments. The fracture lines across the monolith spread rapidly, glowing faintly beneath trapped air pockets as internal pressure forced the outer ice shell outward. A section of the structure cracked open with a sharp explosive snap, releasing a plume of frost vapor that swirled around Harris's outstretched arm. He gasped, his body trembling violently, yet he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, pressing his forehead against the fractured surface while continuing to mutter in the unknown language. Hayes shouted for evacuation again, firing a warning shot into the chamber ceiling in a desperate attempt to snap Harris from whatever trance had seized him. The gunfire echoed thunderously, causing several smaller ice fragments to collapse from the cavern roof. But Harris remained motionless. The chamber temperature plummeted suddenly, condensation freezing instantly along our face masks, while the monolith's vibration shifted into a faster, irregular pulse. I could feel the frequency pressing against my eardrums, producing a high-pitched ringing that blurred my hearing. Ellison dragged his camera across the floor while retreating, still capturing photographs despite his trembling hands, whispering that faint shapes were moving beneath the monolith's fractured surface, shadows shifting slowly, as if something massive stirred within layers of translucent ice. Grady grabbed my shoulder, yelling that the tunnel entrance markers were flickering, their flare light dimming unpredictably, as if air pressure inside the cavern was destabilizing. The floor beneath us shuddered again, cracking further as a deep grinding sound echoed from beneath the monolith, resembling stone dragging across frozen bedrock. Harris suddenly straightened, his body going rigid, then turned slowly toward us. His eyes reflected our flashlight beams unnaturally, pupils dilated so wide they swallowed most of the visible iris. When he spoke again, his voice layered multiple tonal registers simultaneously, producing an unsettling chorus effect that sent chills racing down my spine. He whispered words that sounded almost like English, but twisted into archaic pronunciations, repeating the phrase, "It remembers the path. It remembers the passage." Hayes approached cautiously, extending his hand while maintaining his weapon raised, attempting to guide Harris back toward the tunnel. For a moment, Harris appeared to recognize him, blinking rapidly as if fighting through whatever influence gripped his mind. Then the monolith emitted another violent pulse, sending a shockwave through the chamber that knocked all of us to the frozen floor. Harris screamed, clutching his head while the overlapping voices continued pouring from his mouth in frantic bursts. The fracture along the monolith widened dramatically, exposing a hollow interior glowing faintly with refracted blue light. The shapes Ellison described earlier became briefly visible through the translucent shell, elongated silhouettes shifting slowly as if awakening from suspended preservation. Hayes scrambled to his feet, shouting final evacuation orders while dragging Harris backward by his harness straps. Harris resisted violently for several seconds, his boots scraping across the frozen floor as he struggled toward the fractured structure. Then, without warning, he collapsed, his body going limp while faint whispers continued escaping his lips in fading fragments of that unknown language. The chamber tremors intensified, cracks spreading across the floor and pillars as structural collapse threatened to trap us inside the cavern. Grady ignited emergency flare grenades, their red glow illuminating the spreading fractures and casting elongated shadows that twisted across the monolith's fractured face. Hayes hoisted Harris over his shoulder, screaming for immediate retreat toward the tunnel corridor, while ice fragments rained from the ceiling above us. I grabbed Ellison's arm, forcing him to abandon his fallen equipment as the cavern shook violently around us. The low-frequency chanting resonance continued echoing through the chamber, growing louder, deeper, as though something inside the monolith responded to Harris's contact. As we sprinted toward the tunnel entrance, I glanced back once, seeing the fractured shell widening further, frost vapor spilling outward in thick clouds that rolled across the cavern floor like breath from something buried beneath the glacier. Panic drove us forward through the corridor, but even as we ran, I realized the tunnel walls were vibrating in response to the awakening chamber behind us, and the flare lights marking our escape route flickered erratically, suggesting the path we used to enter might not remain open long enough for us to survive. Panic forced us to retreat, but the tunnel we entered through had already begun sealing itself behind us. The moment we reached the main corridor, I realized the tunnel no longer felt like the same passage we had entered earlier. It felt narrower, longer, and somehow unfamiliar, like a place that had shifted while we weren't looking. Captain Hayes pushed forward. Harris slumped across his shoulders, his breathing shallow and uneven, while faint, unintelligible murmurs slipped from his lips between gasps. Grady ran ahead, placing flare markers along the tunnel walls, but several of the previous markers we had planted were missing, their scorch stains erased as though the ice had healed over them. The vibration from the chamber behind us continued pulsing through the floor beneath our boots, though now it came in uneven surges, causing tiny cracks to ripple along the polished ice surfaces around us. I checked my navigation unit repeatedly, but the display cycled through scrambled coordinates, rotating like layered maps attempting to overwrite each other. The compass needle had begun spinning again, though now it shifted erratically between multiple directions before stopping completely, refusing to settle. Ellison stumbled beside me, his flashlight beam darting across the tunnel walls while he muttered that the carved grooves lining the corridor looked deeper than before, as if the structure itself was stretching outward. Hayes shouted for steady pace, urging us to reach the fracture exit before structural collapse sealed us underground permanently. We followed the flare trail deeper into the corridor until Grady stopped abruptly, raising his hand to halt us. Ahead, the tunnel fork we had marked earlier had changed. The branching passages were still there, but the angles had shifted subtly, the left path now sloping upward instead of descending as it had when we passed through before. The flare residue marking our original direction had vanished completely, leaving only smooth ice where the scorch marks should have been. Hayes cursed under his breath, scanning both corridors before ordering us toward the path that felt closest to the fracture entrance direction based on his memory. We advanced cautiously, but within minutes, the corridor curved again, leading us into a section none of us recognized. The tunnel ceiling dipped lower, forcing Hayes to lower Harris carefully while navigating the tightening passage. The vibration beneath the ice intensified, accompanied by distant rumbling that sounded like shifting stone grinding against frozen bedrock. Grady attempted another radio broadcast out of desperation, but his headset erupted into chaotic static bursts layered with faint, overlapping whispers, repeating fragments of Harris's earlier chanting. He ripped the headset away again, tossing it into the snowpack with visible frustration before rejoining formation. As we rounded another bend, Ellison froze, shining his flashlight toward the tunnel wall with shaking hands. Embedded within the ice were skeletal remains partially exposed through translucent layers. The bones appeared centuries old, preserved in unnatural clarity, their clothing fragments trapped alongside them like frozen time capsules. One skeleton wore remnants of fur-lined garments resembling early Arctic tribal attire, while another, positioned several feet away, wore fragments of maritime uniform fabric consistent with 19th century polar expeditions. Their postures suggested struggle, arms raised as though pressing outward, faces turned toward the corridor as if frozen mid-attempt to escape. Hayes ordered us not to stop, but I couldn't pull my eyes away from the disturbing sight of additional skeletal outlines emerging along the walls as we moved forward, some appearing fused directly into the ice surface as if the tunnel had grown around them. The realization struck me with horrifying clarity. These weren't victims trapped by sudden collapse. They were preserved within a structure that absorbed those who entered too deeply. Harris stirred weakly across Hayes' shoulders, whispering again in that layered voice, his words now forming clearer phrases. He muttered about guardians beneath the ice and paths that correct themselves, his voice trembling between human speech and something older, colder. Hayes urged him to stay conscious, but Harris's eyes remained half open, unfocused, as though he was listening to instructions only he could hear. The corridor widened suddenly into a chamber-like intersection where 3 separate tunnels branched outward in different directions. None matched our remembered entry route. Grady ignited additional flare grenades, their crimson glow revealing deeper carvings along the walls depicting repeating spiral pathways intersecting at circular nodes, each node containing elongated silhouettes resembling figures standing guard around tunnel openings. Ellison photographed the carvings frantically, whispering that the symbols resembled navigation markers, though not designed for humans to follow. The vibration intensified again, accompanied by a deep, resonant tone vibrating through the chamber floor. The ice beneath our boots cracked faintly, thin fissures spreading outward from beneath Harris's hanging arm, as if the tunnel reacted to his presence. Hayes shouted that we needed higher elevation corridors, believing the fracture entrance must still exist above us. We chose the steepest ascending passage and forced our way forward, climbing across slick ice slopes while supporting Harris's weight. The climb grew exhausting quickly, our breathing forming heavy frost clouds inside our masks as the corridor narrowed again. Behind us, the rumbling resonance grew louder, echoing through branching tunnels like distant machinery awakening beneath frozen terrain. Halfway up the incline, Harris suddenly convulsed, jerking violently across Hayes' shoulders while screaming in overlapping tones that made my ears ring painfully. He shouted warnings about the tunnel, reshaping its memory, and claimed that once the structure completed its correction, the surface would no longer be reachable. Hayes nearly lost his footing but regained balance, ordering us to push forward faster. As we reached the top of the incline, the corridor curved sharply and opened into another unfamiliar chamber where the ceiling rose high enough to reveal vertical shafts descending deeper into darkness. Cold air drifted upward from those shafts, carrying faint, whisper-like echoes that blended with the rumbling vibration beneath us. Grady swore he heard movement below, footsteps scraping across unseen surfaces far beneath the floor. Ellison shined his flashlight down one of the shafts, but the beam disappeared into dense shadow without revealing any visible bottom. We pressed forward again, desperation driving us toward any passage sloping upward. The tunnel walls around us shimmered faintly as internal pressure shifted the surrounding ice, producing subtle distortions that made the corridor appear to breathe. My instinct screamed that the tunnel was no longer static terrain. It was a living structure, adjusting itself in response to our movement. Harris's murmuring grew quieter, though he repeated one phrase clearly enough for all of us to hear. "It doesn't want witnesses." Hayes shouted for silence and continued pushing us toward a distant glimmer of pale light reflecting faintly ahead, suggesting possible surface proximity. But even as hope flickered, the rumbling behind us deepened into a continuous roar, and sections of the corridor began sealing slowly, the ice walls shifting inward with grinding pressure. We finally found Harris, but something had already replaced the man we knew. When Harris regained full consciousness, The man we found standing inside that frozen chamber was wearing his uniform, but nothing else about him felt familiar. Hayes lowered him carefully onto the ice floor after his convulsions stopped, but instead of collapsing weakly like an injured soldier, Harris slowly rose to his feet on his own, his movements calm, deliberate, almost rehearsed. His breathing had stabilized completely, and his posture straightened as though exhaustion no longer affected him. The faint, pale glow reflecting off the tunnel walls illuminated his face just enough for me to see his expression, and what struck me first was the unnatural stillness in his eyes. He stared past us rather than at us, his gaze fixed somewhere deeper within the chamber where vertical shafts descended into darkness. Hayes approached cautiously, calling his name firmly, reminding him of mission protocol and urging him to respond. Harris turned slowly toward him, but his reaction lacked recognition. When he spoke, his voice carried a strange dual resonance, two tones layered together, his normal voice and something deeper vibrating beneath it, like sound echoing through frozen caverns. He whispered that the structure beneath us was unfinished, a passage system designed long before recorded history, abandoned but never dormant. His words flowed calmly, each sentence delivered with eerie precision, as if reciting information implanted into his mind rather than spoken from memory. Grady raised his weapon instinctively, whispering that Harris's pupils had dilated until nearly black, reflecting our flare light in thin crescent lines. Hayes stepped closer, refusing to accept what he was witnessing, reaching out to steady Harris by his shoulder. Harris didn't resist, but his head tilted slightly, listening again to frequencies none of us could hear. He explained that the tunnels functioned as conduits, preserving pathways between chambers buried deep beneath polar ice sheets. He described guardians preserved within the glacier, sentinels waiting for structural completion before reopening the network connecting ancient subterranean routes across continents. Ellison lowered his camera slowly, whispering that Harris spoke as though he had memorized knowledge beyond human exploration records. The chamber around us trembled again, ice particles drifting from the ceiling shafts while distant grinding vibrations echoed through unseen corridors. Hayes demanded that Harris move with us toward the surface immediately, but Harris shook his head slowly, repeating that the passage was correcting itself because we had entered before it finished sealing. His layered voice echoed faintly through the chamber, repeating his final words seconds after he spoke them, creating a chilling delay effect that blurred the boundary between speaker and echo. Suddenly, Harris turned away from us and stepped toward the nearest vertical shaft, descending into darkness. Hayes lunged forward, grabbing his arm, shouting that he was under direct military command. Harris paused, looking down at Hayes's grip with mild curiosity, then spoke again in that overlapping tone, warning that those who forced the passage to remain open would be absorbed into preservation, just like those embedded within the tunnel walls. His calmness frightened me more than any aggression could have. Before Hayes could respond, a violent tremor surged through the chamber, cracking the ice floor beneath us and sending shockwaves through the vertical shafts. Harris slipped from Hayes's grip during the vibration and stepped backward toward the shaft edge, his movements fluid and effortless despite the unstable ground. Grady fired a warning shot that ricocheted across the chamber ceiling, sending ice fragments raining around us. But Harris remained unaffected, staring calmly into the descending darkness. He whispered that the Guardians were awakening because the monolith had fractured prematurely, and that our escape would only succeed if the tunnel finished reshaping itself behind us. Hayes shouted again, ordering him to stand down, but Harris simply smiled faintly, a hollow expression that never reached his eyes. The rumbling vibrations intensified, producing a deep resonant tone that filled the chamber like distant chanting carried through frozen stone. Harris turned his back on us completely and walked toward the shaft, stepping onto the icy ledge without hesitation. Hayes attempted to grab him again, but a sudden crack split the floor between them, forcing him to retreat as jagged fissures expanded outward. Harris continued descending slowly into the shaft, gripping protruding ice ridges as though he knew the exact path downward. His voice echoed upward while he descended, repeating warnings about unfinished gateways and the consequences of reopening ancient routes buried beneath polar ice. Ellison screamed for Hayes to let him go, insisting the tunnel would collapse if we delayed longer. Hayes stood frozen for a moment, torn between military loyalty and survival instinct, watching Harris disappear into the descending darkness while his layered voice continued echoing faintly through the shaft. The tremors intensified violently, sending chunks of ice collapsing from the ceiling around us, while the chamber walls groaned under immense structural pressure. Hayes finally shouted for full retreat, ordering us to abandon all equipment and follow him back through the ascending corridor. We sprinted toward the passage entrance as the chamber behind us collapsed further, the resonant chanting tone growing louder as though something deep beneath the ice responded to Harris's descent. The corridor walls vibrated violently as we ran, flare markers flickering unpredictably while cracks spread along the tunnel ceiling. The rumbling behind us grew deafening, and I risked one final glance back toward the chamber. For a brief second, I thought I saw faint silhouettes moving within the collapsing cavern, elongated shapes shifting slowly through drifting frost clouds. But the corridor curved sharply before I could confirm what I had seen. Hayes pushed us relentlessly upward, guiding us through twisting passages that seemed to stabilize just long enough for us to pass, before sealing behind us with grinding pressure. The tunnel air grew colder again, signaling surface proximity, but the tremors continued, threatening to trap us beneath collapsing ice. We finally reached the fracture ascent path where our rope anchors still dangled partially intact. Hayes forced us upward first while he remained behind to ensure structural clearance. As I climbed toward the pale daylight filtering through the fracture opening, the chanting resonance faded gradually, replaced by the familiar howl of Arctic wind echoing through the Glacier Canyon. Grady and Ellison reached the surface first, dragging me upward as Hayes climbed last, pulling himself free just as sections of the fracture wall collapsed inward, sealing the tunnel entrance beneath cascading snow and fractured ice. We collapsed onto the frozen surface, gasping for air, while the glacier beneath us rumbled one final time before falling completely silent. We barely escaped as the tunnel sealed behind us permanently. The glacier never made another sound after sealing the fracture, and that silence haunted me far more than the collapse itself because it felt final, like a door closing on something that had patiently waited centuries to remain hidden. We lay scattered across the frozen surface for several minutes, our lungs burning, frost clinging to our masks, as Arctic winds screamed across the plateau, erasing every visible trace of the opening we had escaped from. Captain Hayes was the first to stand, scanning the glacier with disbelief, watching as drifting snow settled across the collapse zone until the surface looked untouched, smooth, and indistinguishable from the endless white terrain surrounding us. Grady staggered toward our landing site coordinates, attempting to reactivate emergency communication equipment while Ellison remained kneeling near the sealed fracture, snapping photographs obsessively as if terrified the glacier would reopen and prove our survival had been temporary. I sat there staring at the snowfield, replaying Harris's final words echoing through my mind, struggling to accept that the man we had flown in with had willingly disappeared into a place our maps would never acknowledge. Our extraction aircraft arrived after several tense hours, summoned through an emergency flare signal when our radios failed entirely. The pilot never asked questions during the flight back to Outpost K-17, likely instructed beforehand to avoid discussing classified recovery operations. The moment we landed, armed intelligence personnel escorted us directly into isolation quarters, separating us before any of us could compare accounts of what we had witnessed beneath the glacier. My debriefing lasted nearly 12 hours, conducted by officers who showed no visible reaction regardless of how vividly I described the tunnel, the monolith, or Harris's transformation. They repeatedly redirected my testimony toward equipment malfunctions and geological instability, while confiscating Ellison's photographs and Grady's damaged radio logs. Every piece of recorded evidence vanished into sealed containers marked with clearance codes far above my authorization level. Hayes argued aggressively during his interrogation, demanding search and recovery efforts for Harris, but command dismissed his request immediately, labeling Harris as lost during structural collapse with no survivable recovery conditions. Within 2 days, official reports reclassified our entire mission as routine glacial mapping disrupted by natural ice shelf failure. We were issued silence agreements thicker than operational manuals, documents outlining severe penalties for unauthorized disclosure of classified reconnaissance data. I remember signing mine with shaking hands, realizing that whatever truth existed beneath that glacier would never reach public record. Weeks passed, and life at the outpost resumed its mechanical routine, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Equipment malfunctions across our sector increased without explanation, compasses drifting unpredictably even during routine flights far from the fracture coordinates. Grady claimed he occasionally heard faint whisper-like frequencies bleeding into radio channels during night shifts, though he stopped reporting them after command warned him about psychological stress evaluations. Ellison requested transfer repeatedly after his camera equipment was permanently confiscated, his obsession with recovering lost photographs consuming him until he eventually left military service entirely. Hayes remained stationed longer than any of us, but he grew distant, spending hours studying archived polar exploration reports as if searching for historical confirmation that others had encountered similar structures. I returned home after my deployment ended, carrying memories that never faded no matter how many times I convinced myself they were stress-induced hallucinations. Years later, during the early expansion of satellite thermal imaging programs, I encountered a classified briefing referencing unusual heat signatures detected beneath that same glacial region, anomalies dismissed as geothermal irregularities despite lacking any recorded volcanic activity nearby. The coordinates matched the fracture zone with disturbing accuracy. I requested further access but was denied immediately, warned that pursuing restricted archival data could jeopardize my military clearance permanently. That night I dreamed about the chamber again, the pillars surrounding the monolith, and Harris's layered voice whispering warnings about unfinished passages beneath polar ice. The dream always ended the same way, with the faint sound of footsteps echoing through endless corridors that shifted direction each time I tried to follow them. Over the years, I began researching Arctic folklore quietly, searching through indigenous legends and forgotten expedition journals stored in historical archives. I discovered fragmented references to sleeping roads beneath the frozen earth, warnings passed through generations of local tribes cautioning hunters never to follow unnatural tunnels revealed by glacier collapses. One translation described ancient guardians preserved within the ice, protectors of pathways connecting hidden chambers buried deep beneath polar continents. Those warnings were dismissed by early explorers as superstition, yet several lost expedition logs referenced mysterious disappearances occurring near collapsed glacier caverns. None provided detailed explanations, only vague descriptions of echoes, shifting tunnels, and men who wandered into frozen corridors and never returned. I eventually realized that war had simply pushed us into territories humanity had unknowingly avoided for centuries, forcing modern technology to rediscover places older civilizations had chosen to abandon. The Cold War taught soldiers to treat every environment as strategic territory, but what we uncovered beneath that glacier felt less like foreign land and more like forbidden ground. Humanity was never meant to map or occupy. I still remember Harris's final warning, the way his voice echoed through that chamber with calm certainty, as if he understood truths buried beneath time itself. I often wonder whether he survived within that subterranean network, preserved alongside those skeletal remains embedded within tunnel walls, or whether he became part of the structure, guiding its endless reshaping beneath the ice. Satellite reports continue surfacing occasionally, always classified, always dismissed as natural anomalies. Yet each one feels like confirmation that the glacier is not dormant, only patient. The Arctic remains one of the last frontiers untouched by full human exploration, but I no longer believe its isolation protects us from hidden threats. Sometimes, isolation protects ancient things from us. War drives nations to conquer distance, to push technology into hostile environments searching for advantage. But history proves that not every frontier welcomes discovery. Some territories survive by remaining myths, their existence preserved through legends designed to warn rather than inform. The Glacier taught me that humanity's greatest danger is not what we fail to understand, but our refusal to respect boundaries drawn by time, nature, and forgotten civilizations. The tunnel beneath that ice may remain sealed for centuries, or it may open again when shifting glaciers expose its entrance to another generation of explorers convinced they are uncovering new territory. If that day comes, I hope they listen more carefully than we did, because some doors are not meant to be opened, and some paths are not designed for those who walk above the surface of the world. This story is inspired by documented wartime reports, blended with folklore, and dramatized for narrative purposes.